This is part 2 of the 12-bolt axle swap. Let's get to it. Let me wear this hat. Look like I'm going on the funky bunch. Welcome back to the C10 Build. Thanks for joining me. This is part 2 of the 12-bolt swap in the C10. The first video is more of the mock-up and mocking up the disc brakes. And there's a lot to swapping an axle, a lot of little tedious things that I felt like I should include in another video, and that is this video. We're going to be cutting off shock mounts, welding on new shock mounts, getting this thing cleaned up. We'll probably put some new outer axle bearings in it, new seals, and get it cleaned up and ready to go completely back in the truck. So let's talk about what you might be doing. You might not be doing an easy bolt-in swap like this. I got really lucky that all the mounting points on this were the same as the Dana 44 that came out of it, but maybe you're doing a Ford 9-inch swap or a Ford 8.8 or something like that. I got an itch. There's a lot of little things in here that will help you out. And actually in the first video, there's a lot of stuff I talked about in there that's generally applied to any axle swap. I'm fortunate to have a lot of experience on the four-wheel drive side of swapping axles where you're typically gutting and cutting the axle and basically starting from scratch, and that's not what this is. But if you're going to do off-the-shelf 9-inch, or if you find a Ford 9-inch out in the field, you'll be doing similar things on this. So the very first thing I did, I took the disc brake kit back off. That was just a mock-up. I don't want to throw any sparks or any welding slag on the brand new rotors and ruin the disc brake kit, so I took that off. I wanted to add a tech tip right here. If you have an old license plate laying around from one of your old rigs, these are great heat sinks. Now, when I was cutting off the shock mounts, I used a grinder and a torch, and I didn't want to ruin the threads on the brand new U-bolts. Where's my finger? Brand new U-bolts on the axle flip kit. So I just crammed this thing in between there, and you can tell it took some heat. These are made out of an aluminum alloy, and it dissipates heat very quickly. When I worked in collision repair, where we weren't gutting the whole car to do a lot of welding, we would get side impacts where we had to weld right next to carpet. And we'd take a bunch of these and curl them up and jam them against the carpet and then put a welding blanket in there, and they made awesome heat sinks. This is a handy little trick. You'll probably see me use this when I start shaving the firewall in the C10, so save your old plates. If you live in a state where you have to return them, then maybe just steal a few. Just kidding, don't do that. I want to share that handy little tip with you because this has probably kept many projects of mine from going up in flames, and maybe it'll help you. I also mounted the wheels and tires that came with the donor axle, which those things are freaking sweet. When I was in high school, I had a set of those old bias plies, and I loved to run those on my truck. I just thought they looked like the coolest thing. Now they look pretty dorky now that I look at it. But I put those back on and put the truck back down on its weight because we're going to be welding new shock tabs on, and when I took the old axle out, I measured the distance center of the bolt to center of the bolt of the old shock, so we're just going to duplicate that, and we'll be golden. But it was sitting on its. But I want to do all this with the truck sitting on its own weight and own suspension. And yeah, the bed's not on it, but it's not going to make a huge difference in the travel of the shock. I already accounted for that and I already checked that, and there's actually quite a bit of travel. When I was mocking up the axle, I had to cut I don't know where my hand is in the camera. I had to cut the old shock mount off this side so the U-bolt could even fit in there. I didn't realize they're that much wider, otherwise I would have just cut them off from the beginning. I thought I was going to be able to use at least one of the shock mounts. It was just a foolish thing. So I had already cut this side off, I cut that side off, and I ground the axles where the new mounting tabs are going to go, so we have nice clean metal to weld to. And if you're wondering what the hell is he going to use for a shock mount, I'll show you this cool little thing. I'll show you a cool little trick. It's really popular in four-wheel drive life to swap a variety of axles into any vehicle. So they make a lot of axle swapping kits and they piece out the components of those. And one of the beauties for the hot rodding world now is there's an ever plentiful supply of leaf spring perches, weld-on shock tabs. You name it, it exists to put any axle in pretty much anything. So I went on to Summit Racing and I found these weld-on tabs for a 3-inch axle housing, of which this is. And I think these were like $15 or $16 to do both sides. So it's super cheap to swap it. Ripping through forums over the years for off-roading stuff and building hot rods and all sorts of stuff, I've realized it's really intimidating for people to cut and weld and make stuff. And in the reality of that is, from my experience, sometimes I'd rather just start from scratch, just cut everything off and just weld on new stuff. It's just easier than tediously making things fit. Now I'm gonna get these mocked up and get them welded onto the axle tube. It is dusty in here. The axle tube surface where the new mounts are gonna go are ground. So the next thing to do is mock up the shock tabs. This kit's nice. It came with new bolts and everything, which is awesome because the old bolts for the shock were not so pretty. I'll show you a lot of shock tab kits that you'll get. I don't know if you can see that, are offset. I don't know if you can tell, but the bottom tail of this is a little bit longer. It's a little bit offset. And you want to put that where the most downward force is going to be, the most force on it. So in this case where the shock is mounted, it's going to be pushing down towards that. So we're going to put the long tail down. Boom. And I'll tighten up the nut and it will give us the perfect distance here. But before we weld it, we'll take a tape measure and just make sure this is nice and pretty. And I think I'm going to end up welding a gusset on this opening. The shock mount's on the older end, and this 12 bolt, more of a C-channel style shock mount. So I don't want to make this weaker than those ones were. As I said, I'm pretty fortunate that I was able to take a lot of measurements off the old rear end. If you're just throwing a completely different axle setup, you're going to have to do maybe you'll have to do a little bit more work. Let's head over to the truck and I'll get you more up and close and personal of how we're mocking this up. Okay, here we are at the truck. I've got the shock just loose in there on the mount that's on the frame. I've got, you can't see it on that camera, I hope you can see it on the GoPro, but I got the nut and bolt tight for the bottom braces. Now we need to compress this about 2 inches to be able to line up with the axle tube where it needs to. So I looked through my clamps. I don't have any clamps that will work for this size shock right now, but we're gonna do the old zip tie trick. So you chain a bunch of zip ties together, or maybe you have really long ones. This is all I have. You wrap this around like so. If you haven't made a chain of zip ties, you have not lived. All right. So the nice thing with zip ties is you can go incrementally. Each one of those little clicks makes barely a 1/16 of an inch in terms of length, so you can go nice and easy and compress this thing until you get it where you need it to be. I'm gonna go slowly. I don't want to go past. I drop my tape measure. Okay, we're about a half an inch away. You can see how easily you could go right past where you need to. All right, well. Alright, I'm dead center where I need to be. I actually ran into a little snag with my tabs here. It turns out, I don't know if I ordered the wrong size or maybe they sent the wrong ones. I haven't checked. But I don't know if you can see this or if it'll focus. The radius is too tight here. So I'm just going to massage these ears with a grinder until they sit nice and clean on that housing, and then we can get right back to our fit up. Let's get a little closer look at this zip tie situation. I want you to see the hillbilliness we've got going on here. So I'll try to get you closer. Oh, my arm's not long enough. So you can see this is free swinging. I've got my tabs mounted down there, and then I've got my zip tie chain, and that just allowed me to compress this shock to exactly where I need it to be. So let's get those ears and those tabs opened up, and then we're gonna get this thing tacked in. The shock tabs are trimmed. They're all the same length. They fit really well. They're ready to weld. I've got the shock length correct. I've got the bolts tight at the top of the shock and at the bottom. Got that clamped. The only other measurement we need to worry about now is the width measurement. Some rear ends run an offset differential, so do not measure off the center of the differential. It's good to measure off the mounting points, whether it's leaf spring or coil. 99% of the time, those are even width side to side. So I'm gonna measure off the center of the leaf spring perch, and I'll probably go to the mounting flange for the backing plate just to double check that. And then I will finally stop talking at you and we'll start welding these things in. I've got all my appropriate safety gear on. We're ready to burn these things in. Again, we're just tacking these. I prefer to do any heavy welding on an axle tube with the axle shafts out. That way I can blow some air through the tubes and you don't get a lot of heat. I've got to take the axles back out to put the new seals in anyway, so I'll be finished welding it then. And another important safety tip, it's a good idea to wear a respirator while you're welding. Miller makes really cool ones that fit right behind your hood. Throw my hood on and we'll get these things burned in. The new shock tabs are all tacked in. Have I told you how much I hate overhead welding? The right gear helps, keeping your head covered, a good welding jacket, but still those little embers seem to creep in somewhere. I'm gonna cut the zip ties, take the clamps off, and give this a good old-fashioned bouncy test to make sure everything clears and plays nicely together. And I think we're good for the shock mock-up. It's really hard to not look like a damn fool doing the bouncy test, but the bouncy test has to happen. All right, those are good to go. When you're doing the bouncy test sounds ridiculous. I'm sure there's a different name for it. Still got this silly hat on. Things you need to look for. We talked about this in a little bit in the first video of the swap. Is shock angle. Now, I don't have to worry about on this. I got really lucky that there's enough angle on the shock with this being lowered about 5 or so inches that it's still going to have dampening. Now, if your shock is straight up and down, where's my hand? If the shock's more straight up down than mine, you're going to run into dampening issues. You want an angle on that shock. It helps with jounce and dampening. And also, you want to watch how the rear end moves through the suspension curve, because that might change how your shock moves, and it might actually bind against your mounts. So you want to look where it's at the mounting surfaces and make sure the shock tube's going to clear. I need to tell on myself here, I have welded in shock mounts that were touching the shock tube, didn't even realize it. The truck got put back together, went down the road, and had a heck of a banging noise in the rear end. It turns out the shock tube was hitting that bracket. I had to cut it, re-weld it, and reconfigure the whole thing. So just look for clearances. I went really in depth with this, but there's a lot you can learn about fabricating just with a simple little task like this. I've got a couple hours into this, but there's a lot of principles at play. There's a lot of suspension geometry, bases of building and fabricating that you can learn from a little task like this. Just really take your time, break it down, and you'll be able to attack it. We live in the information world. You can figure out anything you want to on the internet now. So just jump into stuff, challenge yourself. The worst you're going to do is screw it up, and you can just do it over again. Shocks are cheap. Shock tabs are cheap. You're not going to make a big mistake doing this. The next part of this that we're going to jump into, this particular rear end had a little bit of water sitting in it when I took the diff cover off. So I really want to go through and flush that out really well. But I want to get the axle out from underneath the truck to do that, because we need to clean up the axle housing to be able to, We need to clean up the axle housing to be able to paint it. I want to finish weld those tabs out from underneath the truck so I can see really well, burn some good welds in it, and put the new axle seals in. So we're going to get this thing pulled out of here, and we're going to move on to the next things. Now that we got the axle all pulled out and set up on saw hearses, I'm going to go ahead and pull the axles out. I want to finish welding up the shock tabs. And getting these brackets ground out. I want to let the heat escape nicely out of this thing. Since we already cleaned up the ends of the rear end housing with a wire wheel, I don't feel like we need to do that again right now. So I'll probably put the new seals in while we're at it, put the axles back in, and then work on the pinion seal. You've already seen me pull the axles out in part 1, so I'm not going to film a ton of that because I just don't want to bore you to death. But let's rock on. Give you a little closer look as to what's going on here. I pulled the outer seal. Oh, of course it's not bright enough for you. I pulled the outer seal and you can see the bearings exposed there. I looked closely. I spun the bearing around closely, cleaned it off with brake cleaner to make sure there was no pitting or any rust in the bearings. They spin very nicely. Once we put the new seal in, we will grab some gear lube and put it right on the bearings and spin that around to make sure they're flooded and good to go. But they look really good on this end. I'm going to go to the other side, pull the other seal, get that cleaned up, check that out. But from initial inspection, the bearings look good over there. I'm just taking brake cleaner and kind of squirting out the axle tubes. There's just some old gunky gear lube in there that I want to get out of there. All in all, it looks pretty good in there. We still have a little bit more cleanup to do, but I'm pretty happy with this axle so far. All right, I'm going to get back to it. Things are looking pretty good. Things are looking pretty good here. We got the entire case cleaned up, wire wheeled, and we got the shock tabs fully welded. We're gonna let this thing cool down for a little bit, and then we'll put our new seals and new axles in. Once we get the axles put back in, we'll take the pinion yoke off and get the pinion seal swapped out too. Fortunately for me, the bearings were good in this rear end, so I just needed to clean up the surfaces where the new seal pressed in. The edges of the axle tubes are rolled over a little bit, so I just took some emery cloth and knocked those edges down.
I know, I should be using a socket or a seal installing tool to do this, but if you're gentle, this way works too. Then I gave the bearings a healthy squirt of lube. Sliding the axle back in with the new seals in is a little bit tricky. It's really easy to roll the edge of the seal, so you have to be very, very gentle and just slowly make sure the axle is centered in the hole and do not force it.
All right, I put the axles back in for the last time, I hope. Those new axle seals are nice and tight, which is bueno. This thing is going to be money when it's done. Now on to the pinion seal. I've been spraying this down for quite a while with some penetrating oil, some PB Blaster, so hopefully this nut comes off very easily. It's pretty dark in here, but this is just full of yuck and muck in there. So I'm gonna grab a socket and my impact, and hopefully it just comes right off. I have several different types of 2-jaw pullers. I'm hoping we don't need that. Because there's not a great spot to grab on the yoke of this. Most of the ones I've changed, I've had pretty good luck with just tapping evenly on the back side of the yoke. Nothing too hard that's going to distort it or chip it or anything like that. And it was able to pop right off. So I'm kind of hoping that happens, but we shall see.
After I loosened the pinion nut, I gave the pinion yoke a couple smacks with a hammer, and much to my surprise, it almost fell off. Which brings me to my usual point: make sure you pre-lube any fastener you think you're going to touch on your vehicle. Just hammer that thing with the sauce, and your life will be much easier. This pinion seal was completely trashed and beat up, so I scraped a lot of the crusted rubber away from the outside edge before I tried to pull the seal off, so all that stuff didn't fall down inside the rear end. This style pinion seal is a press-in, but it also has a flange that goes over top of the housing, so I was able to slide a sharp putty knife in there and get this pinion seal loose. Again, more precautionary lubrication. Make sure you pay attention here. I'm about to show you how to use a hammer the wrong way and install a seal the wrong way.
I feel like I make assumptions at the beginning of the project that one part's gonna be way harder than the other. And on this one, I thought the pinion seal was gonna be a real pain in the butt, and it turned out that the other axle seals were the pain in the butt. I am pleasantly surprised by how easy this pinion seal is going. This is by far the easiest one I've ever done. I'm going to set the yoke back in, get it bolted up. I gotta check this. I gotta look up the torque specs online and make sure we have it torqued right. We don't want this thing coming off. And then you've probably noticed I've been putting a little bit of oil on the bearings as I go, just to keep those lubricated. I'm gonna flip the case upside down and pour a little bit of oil in there, try to get in the bearings, working in, roll everything around nicely, because we wiped pretty much everything out with the brake cleaner. I wanna make sure there's still oil in those bearings so we're not getting so they're not sitting there dry, getting surface rust on them. Okay, now the moment that I've been waiting for. Everything spins very nicely. I'm pleased with the way this turned out. It's time to permanently attach the cover. But I want the cover to be permanently on there. I want everything painted all at once and be able to just put it underneath the truck, fill it with fluid, and roll down the road. I'm gonna get all the mating surfaces cleaned up, round with the bolts, and we'll throw that back cover on there.
Before I even grind a surface where I'm about to put an adhesive or silicone on, I make sure I clean it and clean it again with brake cleaner to make sure there's no oil residue on the surface. If you grind it before you clean it, you're just grinding all the oil and contaminants right into the metal surface, and it's even harder to get out. So make sure you clean it before you grind it.
Okay, we got the rear end nice and painted. It's a little dark back here. With the KBS coating, the same stuff I used on the frame here to give you a little better look. It's similar to Port 15, but for whatever reason, I've just had better luck with this KBS stuff, so that's what I use. It dries super durable. I love it. I got the rear end up on some dollies, and we're going to shove it underneath the truck and get this bad boy mounted up.
I didn't cover painting with the KBS coating in this video. I did a really full in-depth video on painting the frame. Just like Port 15, it's a multi-step process. It's very tedious, but if you follow directions to a T, you'll end up with a really good finished product that lasts a really long time. As I said, I prefer KBS over Port 15. For whatever reason, I've just had better luck with it in longevity.
Man, I tell you what, this is surprisingly hard getting this stuff reassembled because we have to be nice and delicate with everything, which I am not very good at. I'm just going to keep wiggling this thing back and forth, trying to get in place nice and gently. Of course, we got to put the leaf springs in underneath the axle, so that's going to be pretty tedious too. But I'm just going to keep rocking on. Things are going pretty well, getting the rear end bolted back in. One thing I'm particular about when I completely reassemble stuff, I make sure all the threads and the hardware are cleaned up. Usually I do that as I'm disassembling. That way I don't have to do it now. But there were a few threads that got boogered up with fitting up this rear end the 600 or so times we had to do that. So I got the thread chaser out, a little bit of grease, and we're greasing things up. And I am so glad that I was able to find a bushing for this rear shackle, because this rear shackle is nice and tight now, which that should make a considerable difference in drivability. We are cruising right along. We should have this thing bolted up soon. I cannot wait. I came in this morning, went through and tightened all of the hardware in the suspension. The leaf spring bolts, the shackle bolts, the U-bolts that hold the rear end housing to the leaf springs, the shocks. It's really important to work through this stuff in stages just so you don't get off track, especially when it comes to tightening essential bolts. I have a personal rule where I won't start tightening anything if I can't finish it. Last night I wanted to go home, I wanted to go to bed. So I set all the bolts in the holes, set the nuts up on the frame rail so I could see them, and so I knew that nothing was tight. And I came this morning and I started and didn't stop tightening all of these. That way I know they're tight, they're torqued, everything's good to go. I double checked the torque on the dry shaft bolts, that's good to go. On a project this big, it's super easy to forget to tighten crucial bolts. Ask me how I know. I've been there, I've done that. And I've developed my own little systems like this just to make sure that I don't run into any pitfalls. I don't want to be ripping this thing down the road and have something come loose. And now we are coming full circle. We're gonna be bolting the disc brake kit that we mocked up on this in part 1 of the axle swap and get that all bolted up. We'll get that all bolted up and we'll get the plumbing on the housing and we'll see how damn cool that looks. Now, if you remember many moons ago to part 1 of this 12-bolt swap, we mocked up all the disc brake conversion stuff while the axle was all dirty and crummy, and this is where it pays off. Now we're reassembling stuff. Everything is mocked up. We know it fits perfectly. We can just go ahead and bolt it on. And I even labeled all the brackets. There's an L for left here, and I even labeled the order of the spacers that go in here. So that way everything will just bolt right up to the truck and we can just keep moving on. And this is the importance of doing a mock-up as soon as possible. You don't really want to be mocking up this kind of stuff once everything's all done. What if I would have had to get a different axle or something like that? We would have known it months ago. Now that we're reassembling, the truck's about to go to paint, we can just bolt this stuff on and go. This kit utilizes a caliper from, I think it's a Cadillac Eldorado, that has a parking brake built into the actual caliper itself. It's really neat. I've seen this application before on off-road type vehicles where they utilize this caliper. A lot of other four-wheel disc brake vehicles that have a parking brake have a parking brake drum built into the rear rotor. This is really nice that it doesn't have that. And especially, it'll be nice on a manual transmission vehicle like this to have a nice brand new working parking brake. So I'm gonna throw these cables in and we'll keep plumbing. Just kidding, we won't be doing that. After reviewing the footage for the plumbing, it didn't really add a lot to the video. It was just me bending a few lines over the rear axle. And this video was already long enough. Now, why did I do a 2-part video on something as simple as an axle swap? For a very good reason. An axle swap is something very simple, especially this one that was practically bolt-in, but look at how many little tiny nuanced things that you can pick up and you can learn on your project vehicle. The point I'm trying to make here, and the point I always try to make, is just get out there, work on your stuff. Even the smallest little project, you can learn a ton of stuff from. The more you challenge yourself and grow your skills, the more stuff you can do on your own vehicles, and you can build some really cool stuff, but also you can go make some darn good money fabricating stuff or just swapping parts. There's a large community of people that just want to own cool stuff. They don't want to build it, and they want people like you and me to build it for them. I love bringing you on the journey of how I think about what I'm doing. I really teach you how to think and problem solve through all of these projects than to just quickly spoon feed you something that you can apply once. But if you learn how to think through these projects and look at them analytically, you can tackle any portion of your project vehicle. I'm gonna leave you right here. As always, I'm Jim Murphy. You can follow me between videos over on Instagram at YouBreakItYouFixIt. Hit me up and down in the comments below. If you like this video, subscribe, stick around. I've got a lot of cool stuff coming up. We've got projects sitting in the driveway that we're waiting to get to that we're gonna be doing some really cool things to. So you wanna stick around for that. A subscriber notified me just this morning that they haven't been seeing my videos come up. So make sure you hit that bell button so you're notified every time a new one is uploaded. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button and I'll see you in another video.